Well, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tamara Ecker, Managing Director of British American Business, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the next session in our DEI series, The Stir. For those of you, very briefly, who are not familiar with BAB, we are the trade association exclusively supporting companies with operations in both the US and the UK markets and working to make that trade corridor even more vibrant and easier to navigate. As an organization, we run over 100 events per year, both virtual and in person, and cover a range of themes impacting our member companies with DEI front and center. Today, we have two incredibly accomplished and special executives, pioneers really, on the DEI front, who will share their experiences and insights around creating a diverse workplace. We may not get it all right today, but the more that we can bring these topics to the forefront, the more progress we can make. Before we jump in, I'd like to take this opportunity to remind everyone that this event is part of our STIR series, as I mentioned, discussing diversity, equity, and inclusion against a backdrop of US and UK business. It is a series built in partnership with our members to address these cross-cutting issues, regardless of sector, geography, or company size. This program is made possible with thanks in large part to our annual sponsors, who are ACCA, Broadridge, EY, Fitch Ratings, and National Grid. It's now my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Suki Sandhu, founder and CEO of Audeliss and Involve. Suki is not only one of the UK's leading specialists in sourcing exceptional diverse talent, he is a sought-after commentator, founder of Audeliss, a global executive search firm, and founder of Involve, a global network and consultancy championing diversity and inclusion in business. Suki is also a philanthropist, serves on a number of boards, and was awarded an OBE from the Queen in the 2019 New Year's Honors. Suki, it's a pleasure to have you, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Tamara. I always find it interesting when I hear my bio. It makes me feel really uncomfortable. I need to get the team to edit it down a lot.
I tried to keep it short. I tried to keep it short.
But really, really happy to be here today. And yeah, and even happier that I'm getting to interview a really, really dear friend of mine, an amazing businesswoman, Karen Blackett. Karen is the UK president of WPP, which is one of the world's largest marketing services groups, and is one of the foremost voices for increasing representation and diversity in business, which includes incredible initiatives at WPP, which I'm sure she's going to tell us more about today, as well as with nonprofits both sides of the Atlantic, which are changing the face of leadership. Karen was also this year's Involve's #1 Heroes Woman Role Model Executive, which is a great testament to all the work she's done for diversity and inclusion. Now, I've got lots of questions for Karen during this session, but we do want to try and make this as interactive as possible. So the people that are on the Zoom here today, the chat function is open. So if you have any questions that you want to ask, please do put them into the chat room and I'll try and pose them to Karen throughout the conversation, just so it's a little bit more interactive. But I'm going to launch straight in with my first question, if that's all right with everyone. So Karen, nice to see you. Hello.
Hello, good to see you as well.
How are you today, first of all? How are you doing?
I am winning today, so I'm good. I'm great. Thank you.
Happy Monday.
And to you?
Okay, so lots of companies are still feeling uncomfortable talking about race in the workplace. Our research, for instance, showed that nearly 3/4 of people are uncomfortable using words like Black, Asian, or mixed race when talking about people in the workplace. How do we well, first of all, what do you see as the main barriers and how do we overcome them? And are there differences between the UK and the US?
So look, it's something which in the boards that I sit on, I try and make sure that it is an agenda point for us to be able to familiarize ourselves and become comfortable talking about race. I think it's a very British thing that we're very uncomfortable talking about race. I think we've become much more au fait and comfortable talking about gender and issues with gender equality and gender representation. I think we're better than we were in terms of talking about sexuality as well. We've got a lot of work to do when it comes to talking about ability, but I think race is one of those areas where people feel uncomfortable. And I always say, look, you've got to get comfortable feeling uncomfortable, because if we're not talking about it, then we're not doing enough. And it needs to be an agenda point to start normalizing having these conversations. So a lot of it is to do with fear, people being fearful of saying the wrong thing or using the wrong term. And that's where I genuinely believe that if somebody does make a mistake, you have got to give grace, or else the conversation will never come back to the table again, or people will be even more fearful of raising it. So you've got to give grace. But I also feel as though what helps with the conversation is having data, and having really good data to come back to and anchor conversations in data, take emotion out of it and anchor it in data, and anchor it in terms of performance and where you want to go. I do think there's a big difference between the UK and US. We may talk the same language, but I actually think in terms of where we are in the life stage of talking about racial equality and racial equity, I do think the UK is behind, because we don't necessarily have the same legislation or same policies for us to have to talk about race if you're in a business in the UK, and for us to measure how we're doing and how businesses are doing when it comes to race.
Do you think it's also something to do with a little bit, I know we're going off script here slightly, but something to do, and we're probably going to do that a lot in this conversation, Karen, I know you so well. But if you try and compare like race, the inclusion journey for race, and say the inclusion journey for gender's probably had a lot more movement. I think largely because a lot of the straight white men in charge have, say, daughters, right? Or
wives
they
or
exposed
mums.
to gender, or mums or sisters, whereas when it comes to race, if they're all majority straight white men, which they are, fact, in positions of power and influence in business, they're not being exposed to racially diverse communities. Do you think that has to do with it as well?
Look, 100%. And you and I both know a brilliant woman called June Sarpong, who wrote a brilliant book called Diversify. And she coined a phrase, check your circle, which is about who are your people around you, who are your trusted advisors that you go to when something great happens, or you go to when something terrible happens and you want advice. And for most people in positions of power in organizations, their circle is not diverse. So their circle may have a woman in it. It is very rare for that immediate circle to have anybody of color in it. Really rare. And I also think another factor is that this terrible phrase of ethnic minority is like an amalgamation. We've de-averaged a race. So we're not talking about, one race. It is a collection of different races from the global majority, not ethnic minority. And again, we've created this homogenous block of people, which it's nuanced. And again, that can stop conversations, because people will talk about, and I've heard this even recently, people talking about Black History Month and then talking about somebody who's Indian. And I'm like, no, Black History Month is about.
But then this is also when there's that conversation around understanding the difference between race, ethnicity, and nationality, which a lot of people get very confused.
Absolutely.
Like, between the three.
And that means that people won't talk about it because it is complicated. It is complex. And you need people in your circle that can help you understand it and coach you and be with you and give grace and forgiveness if things go wrong.
Or businesses like Involve that run learning and development and workshops on things like race.
Well, you should be in a circle of trust. You should be in that circle.
Absolutely. You mentioned earlier about data and measurement. So I just wanted to touch on that for a second. So leaders know that what gets measured gets done, but what role do you think data does play in progressing Black and other diverse representation?
Look, I've seen it in our businesses across WPP. When you are able to have that granular detail, you can see where people drop out on their career journey. So many organizations put a lot of effort in at grassroots level to bring people in. I always talk about how it should be representative of the area that they serve, so representative of the locality that you're in. So there's no point trying to have representation, you know, in the UK, in Edinburgh, which is the same as representation in London, because you've got a very different makeup in terms of, you know, population in those areas. But I absolutely can see when we track data and look at data that we're doing a lot at the grassroots levels, and so many organizations, then something happens and it becomes a leaky bucket. So people come in, but something happens on the journey and they churn out. So that data then allows you to go in and identify where that dropout is happening or where the progression isn't happening, to then go in and do listening circles to understand what's happening, and then put in place the right program. So, you know, at WPP, there is a brilliant program called Elevate, which is focused on Black women. Because, you know, Suki, I'm a unicorn when it comes to our industry, that you do not get Black female CEOs in senior management. So our Elevate program is about connecting our Black female talent, because that's where we've identified a lack of progression, with our Global Exco for a year's worth of sponsorship, not mentoring, sponsorship. So I do think the data is really important, and the granularity of the data, so you can identify where there is an issue and you can put in place the right programs.
And how important do you think targets are? Because I think only 23% of Fortune 100 companies have set race-based targets.
Look, to me, it's a business metric, which is about performance. So if there is a target set on cash flow, there's a target set on EBITDA, or there's a target set on revenue growth, less pass-through costs, there should be a target set on diversity metrics, because it is an incredibly important performance metric. So I do think it's really important. But again, it's making sure that those targets are placed over a period of time, which doesn't encourage knee-jerk reaction, which can be terrible for an organization. And it's about realistic targets over a period of time. So I'm always, and you know this, Suki, I'm always more focused on a 3 to 5 year target rather than a 12-month target. Of course, you need to have milestones along the way to try and hit, but I think over a longer period of time just means that you don't get leaders or managers with a knee-jerk reaction to hit a target, which I do believe that target should absolutely correlate to a remuneration of the individual. I really do, because then it's meaningful and it will be focused on. But you want to make sure that the behavior doesn't occur where you try and do everything possible to hit a target and then that target's not sustainable. It doesn't last, and you get that churning out happening in an organization.
Yeah, I think it's also really important, Karen, that these targets are communicated both internally and externally.
Because if they're not, it's not a target.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's holding them accountable, right, to actually doing the target. So I know LVMH,
And that's,
for instance, yeah,
that's the bit I mean about it has to be linked to remuneration.
yeah. I mean, I think that's a separate thing entirely, because there are more and more companies doing that, particularly when I think what we've seen with other companies we've spoken to is that some execs will think, oh, you know, the target's there as part of their compensation, but, you know, nothing's going to happen. And then when they do actually get hit with their bonus or some of it not being given to them, they then take action in year 2 because they see the financial implications. So I think it definitely does work as an incentive to get them to take action for sure.
Yeah. And look, I sit on the board of Diageo, which is a brilliant board to sit on, and Diageo take their targets around sustainability and around diversity in equal importance as their targets around cash flow and their targets around growth. And that's the way it should do. It is a business metric which helps your organization grow in terms of size and grow in terms of value.
Fantastic. Just to the people on the Zoom, still looking out for your questions, so don't be shy. I'm keeping an eye on the chat function because I've got loads to ask, but I'm sure you all have questions too. So please do put them in the chat function. You mentioned sponsorship earlier, Karen. So diverse leaders tend to be overly mentored and under-sponsored. So how important is sponsorship to improving representation, do you think?
So look, it's understanding the difference between the two. So mentorship is about getting wise counsel and sage advice from people that have gone before with lots of experience. They can be within your own organization, or they can be outside of your organization. Sponsorship is about skin in the game. It's about having a vested interest in seeing the individual that you sponsor progress after your period of contact and after your period of sponsorship. And that progression could be not always an opportunity to be promoted, but it could be about, you know, being able to go on a training program that they would never normally have had access to, or being put on a project team which they would not have been considered for. It's about a vested interest in having progression of that individual, and it's about skin in the game. And it's about somebody talking up for what that individual is capable of in the rooms that they do not have access to yet. So that you've got somebody there representing you, voicing about your talent and talking about your talent and what will happen if you're given an opportunity. For every single role that I have had somebody sponsoring me and talking about what I'm capable of if I'm put in the role. And I think it's incredibly important that people from a global majority background absolutely have that. I genuinely do. And it goes back to the point that we mentioned about not being in people's circle. When you check that circle, if there's not anybody that's in it, there's not going to be anybody advocating for you. So that's why it's really important that that circle of trust, you've got somebody advocating for you, because you're not necessarily going to be in that circle of people making the decisions about where the next opportunity goes.
Completely agree. And for me, it's also about what the sponsor says about you when you're not in the room.
Yeah.
Like that kind of elevation of your brand to give the opportunities. And mentoring is great, but for me, I completely agree with you. I think sponsorship is far more important.
Yeah.
If we really want to drive change, and straight white men do it naturally, they do it themselves within their communities, sponsoring each other, that we need diverse communities to do the same as well. So
yeah.
I wanted to move on to, because it's quite topical, programs supporting diverse talent are currently in the firing line following the Supreme Court ruling on affirmative action in the US. Have you seen any impact to talent programs in terms of any impact at all when it comes to increasing representation?
I am pleased to say no, because I think if you are working in organizations or working with organizations that understand the impact of diverse talent on creative thinking, on problem solving, it's not about altruistic reasons why you're doing it. Of course, you should be doing it because it's the right thing to do, but this is about business performance. So it's not about we're doing it because it's a purposeful thing to do or it's the right thing to do. You should be doing it because it actually means that your business is going to get better, and it's actually about future-proofing your business. It's about delivering growth. So I am fortunate that I am working in an organization and working with organizations where those Supreme Court rulings have not had an effect, because the focus is on performance and the focus is on growth. The focus is on future-proofing an organization. But, you know, maybe I work with very, very switched on organizations, and maybe those organizations are being advised by companies like yours. It shouldn't have an impact because it's about performance.
Yeah, it's a really, really challenging time, particularly in the US, I would say, because that's where the ruling was. And also, remember, this ruling was also about higher education, not business.
Yeah.
But then there was that whole the 10 attorney generals from red states that wrote to the Fortune 100 CEOs saying, you know, it's illegal for you to do anything diversity and inclusion wise or have race targets. And then a few weeks later, 20 attorney generals from blue states wrote to the Fortune 100 CEOs saying, don't listen to that letter, it's to intimidate you, you need to double down on your efforts. And it's confusing for CEO receiving these two letters. It's a little bit like Dynasty or Dallas, like some drama happening in the US. And I think what we've seen with some of the companies is they're definitely a little bit more aware of the climate, and so they're definitely doing like almost a legal audit of a lot of their diversity and inclusion interventions, because there is an entity that's been set up by this right-wing organization to sue companies that, for instance, are setting targets for Black women, or to get, there was one VC fund, I think, that was sued because they were allocating some of their funds to Black women founders,
or Black colleges.
Yeah, which is like tiny number. So we're definitely seeing a little bit of nervousness around it. But then there's companies like LVMH, for instance, who are in the US, and they're like, business as usual, don't care. We've got our targets for Black and race representation in our leadership team. We're going to get on with it. But they're a French company in the US. So it's interesting how they're probably not as concerned about it as, say, maybe some of the US businesses. But we are seeing a little bit of nervousness around it, actually, as a result of the action.
And look, it's about the core of your business, isn't it? And it's about the strength of your CEO as to where you're going to go and what you think, not just the right thing to do from a moral perspective, but the right thing to do in terms of future-proofing your organization. And yet, I absolutely get, if I think about my industry and it comes to advertising, communications, people are, you know, ensuring that they think carefully about what is portrayed in ads, that it can be polarizing because you have got so much division that exists at the moment, that there is more careful thinking which happens. But again, it's about being true to your DNA and being true to your purpose, to do the right thing. I went to a training program last week, and there was a brilliant phrase which was used, which was about the world and society at the moment needs a heart transplant, because something's really happened whereby we're not always thinking about the right thing to do, and that this polarization is really happening here in the UK as well as in the US. To your point about, you get people from the red states and people from the blue states having totally different viewpoints, and it's about what we are as a society and a heart and what the right thing is to do.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's that polarization which is the biggest issue. Like, I feel like we've lost the art of compromise. No one wants to meet in the middle anymore. You're either one or the other, which is really frustrating. We've got some really good questions in the chat, Karen. So we're going to go off script here now for a bit, so because I want to address some of these. So Lindsay Simpson's got a great question here. If we step up a level from specific diversity characteristics such as gender and race, how are the panel addressing ageism, given the only growth talent pool across developed nations is the over 50s?
Well, Lindsay, I can tell you what we're doing at WPP. So we have got, because I believe in a multi-generational workforce, I genuinely do. And I believe it's about marrying creativity from all walks of life. And one of the programs which we started in the UK, actually, which is now rolling into the US, is a program which is called Visible Start. And it is a program specifically focused on midlife women who have taken a career break, whether that's for caring reasons, raising a family, whatever it may be, but a 6 weeks program teaching them about digital and data, which is obviously the growth area in our industry. And then after that program, trying to place them in roles within our different agencies at WPP. And so far, we've had 750 women go through our Visible Start program, which we started in the UK. In fact, one of our graduates who then went on to secure a role, who's age 60, and she won't mind me in saying that, was one of the women named in the Future Leaders list for Heroes, for Involve's Heroes list, which is brilliant, a future leader at the age of 60. So I absolutely believe in a multi-generational workforce, and the area where we have focused, and to begin the focus, is on midlife women who have taken a career break.
That's fantastic. Because I agree, Karen. I think there's been a huge focus on like Gen Z in the workplace. And I feel like almost the older generation is being a little bit left behind. So it's really good to hear that WPP is taking specific action. And I think one of the biggest challenges, obviously, of an intergenerational workforce, which are 5 different generations, is actually the stereotypes or discrimination you see against the different generations. So Gen Z being entitled and lazy, millennials being old and not with it. They don't understand, like,
But,
there's all these things that people say across
but
generations.
you
Part of it is just building empathy across the 5, right?
but you look at some of the communications. If I look at advertising, and advertising that used to be focused on the 55 plus, it was always an old couple with grey hair walking on a beach. That was always the portrayal of people aged 55 plus. I'm 52. I think I'm a long way from being a geriatric with grey hair walking on a beach. So I do think, I absolutely believe that there is a stereotype in terms of how we see different generations, for sure, which is why a multi-generational workforce is really good to dispel all of that. It really is.
Agreed. Duncan, thank you for sharing your age of 60. I'm going to ask your question now next. So Duncan Edwards has asked, can we...
Duncan, you look fantastic at 60.
I was going to say, he does look great. So he's asking, can we talk about more about the differences we found between the US and the UK when it comes to inclusion and diversity? I know we touched on it briefly, but maybe just a little bit more.
Look, I think it is front and center in terms of every decision-making board in the US. It will have a agenda point. That does not happen in the UK. I think when it comes to reporting data of an organization, it is something that you have to, especially when it comes to race, it is something that you have to do in the US. It is not yet in the UK. It is not part of legislation. We got close to it and then it didn't quite happen. So it means that companies don't have to report their data. If you don't report the data, you can ignore it and not do anything about it. I also think I was talking earlier about this homogenous mass, which is called ethnic minorities. I think the US is better at recognizing different communities, and the UK isn't.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Suki.
No, I would actually agree with all of that, but I actually sometimes feel in the US there's more talk about diversity and inclusion than actual action. So that's a big difference that I've seen. And actually, I think the UK legislation-wise is further ahead when it comes to diversity and inclusion, because in some states, obviously, you can still be fined for being LGBT plus, for instance, right? So I feel like there's a little bit more of a journey that the US needs to go on to be more equal, because also the US is so fragmented with its 50 states, and they all have different ways of doing things. It gets quite challenging to try and navigate the D&I landscape in the US itself, because the states tend to always be quite insular and think about themselves, which is
a
fine.
federation rather than one country.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think that's something that's quite hard and challenging to manage across the US, because it's like 50 different countries in one. But yeah, I do think the UK, well, things like gender pay gap reporting, I know ethnicity pay gap reporting isn't a requirement yet, but hopefully we're going to get there. And we've seen some companies obviously voluntarily do that. We did the campaign together, actually, Karen, a few years ago to try and got about 50 major companies to report on their ethnicity pay gap reporting.
Yeah.
I think it's pretty good. From a disability neurodiversity perspective, again, I think the UK is a little bit more advanced than the US when it comes to having that conversation and trying to have it at board level. So things like the Valuable 500, which was set up from the UK, which is an initiative around disability and neurodiversity, I think they're trying to do it more global. I think a lot of their companies are actually more UK based and Europe based rather than US. So I think that's kind of a bit of a journey they've got to go on as well, I would say. But also that just means there's lots of opportunities for growth. It's just the anti-diversity and inclusion, anti-woke sentiment that's on both sides of the pond, which I think has an impact on what companies actually do.
That is true. And look, my comment is about in terms of race. I think the US is further ahead, much further ahead than the UK, for sure.
Well, there's a question. I don't, because it's a direct message. I don't know if I can give the name. It might be a private question, so I'm just going to do the question without giving your name. Apologies. If you'd like me to mention your name, by all means, put it on the chat to me, and I can. There is a huge appetite for creating a women in business group or a safe race-based group at my company, but the senior leadership team are slightly opposed to these ideas as they believe it is causing more segregation and that everyone should be able to join these groups if they are established. Do you think that's the case?
So look, I think it's really important to have a employment resource group focused in certain areas to make sure that you get a groundswell of support and also a groundswell of action for things to change. But what I always say, and again, I'd especially say this with our gender ERG, which is called Stella, that we have at WPP, when we, and look, that ERG works and focuses on policies to make sure that we keep women in our organisation. So there's been a big focus on menopause policy that we've had recently. Obviously a big focus on child caring policies as well. But when we have events and when we're talking, we have a special guest speaker or an interview with somebody, I always say, bring a man. Because if we want things to change, to your point, Suki, most of the people still in charge tend to be men, white men. So you need to bring that person who's going to be an ally and help you create change. But I do think that there needs to be a groundswell of people from that same diverse characteristic, whatever it may be, to be able to work on policy action together, to be able to support and work together to make sure that you future-proof those roles and those people in your organisation. But when it comes to events, bring somebody not from that characteristic who is an ally to help create change. Do you agree, Suki?
Completely. Actually, completely agree with everything you said. I think allyship is the key thing here, is like trying to make sure that we get the majority in the room as well, but creating that safe space for each community. So completely agree.
Yeah.
Duncan has another question here where he said, is a DEI statement part of all the RFPs that you get at WPP?
I'm not sure what you mean by DEI statement, but we are having more and more clients ask for our DEI data and metrics. So asking what the makeup of the organization is. And also clients asking to see diverse teams when they're presenting. So there's not a statement, but we do need to supply our data. And if I think about 5 years ago, that wasn't the case. Now it's more noticeable when an RFP, which is a request for information, doesn't ask it.
Great. I just want to change tact now, just to get back to some of the questions that I had, Karen, and just talk about representation in the boardroom. So we know that in 2021, Black women held only 5% of board seats in the S&P 500, but no Black women hold board seats in the FTSE 100. To be fair, in the FTSE 100, I think obviously you have one seat. I could think of Arlene at Compass Group has another, but there are very few Black women in the FTSE 100 boardrooms. So many companies still lack diversity and remain pale, male, and stale, as one might say.
What's your other word for it, Suki?
The other one, all full of white old rich men, worms, which is something that I've heard a lot as well. Do you think this is changing, and what do you think is holding up progress?
Look, it's not changing quickly enough, and I find it deeply, deeply frustrating. I really do, and that's part of the reason why, post the murder of George Floyd, I had just about had enough. I was exasperated with the glacial pace of change, and myself and a few others, so For those in the UK, you'd know David Lammy, you'll know the historian David Olusoga, you know the amazing Dame Vivian Hunt, who I know is familiar to BOB, and Rick Lewis, who set up Tristan Capital, and Kwame Kwei Armar, the artistic director of the Young Vic and also a film director. We created the Black Equity Organisation because we had just about had enough of the glacial pace of change. But as per this conversation, what's really important is data, and we wanted to be fact and evidence based. So we took 2 years researching where there was inequity between Black and others, so that we had our 6 strategic pillars. So look, it's a known fact, and one of those pillars is economic empowerment, which relates to, you know, access that people of color have, but also about who is setting the agenda for our businesses, whether it's here or in the US. And we actually took a lot of advice from the NAACP when we set up, to understand how they work, how they structured themselves, how they convened. And look, I do think it goes back to the point that we were mentioning, Suki. It's about who's in your circle. So when it comes to those appointments, who's in your circle, to make sure that it's not the same answer all the time. And I know, Suki, and I know you won't mind me saying this, that you held a dinner for chairmen recently of boards, which you held at Fortnum and Mason. I remember you posted a picture of that room on LinkedIn. And I remember WhatsApping you going, well, therein lies the problem, because it was just a room of white men of a certain age. I think I spotted a few women, but it was mostly white men of a certain age. And then if you think about their working with their senior independent director and their CEOs of those FTSE 100 or FTSE 250 boards, to look at NEDs and to look at, you know, succession management for CEO, unless their circle is slightly broader than what that room looks like, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that the room's never going to change.
Yeah, I mean, that dinner you mentioned, I mean, we were also concerned because it was really undiverse, and there were about 60 people in the room, and probably 8 diverse chairs out of that 60, I would say, were in the room, and largely gender. Racially diverse was probably 3 in the entire room. And obviously a lot of it also is about availability, right? Because we obviously have a diverse network, but it's still not that great in the chair seat specifically. So there is definitely lots more work to do there. And you're right, the SID has a lot to do with that, because the senior independent director, because they're the ones that drive the process to hire a new chair, but then they normally don't really understand what a good hiring process looks like. So we hosted a senior independent director in the House of Lords earlier this year before the summer. And it was a full house. Everyone turned up. Some of my team didn't even have a seat because everyone turned up. That normally never happens. But we had 2 big chairs talking about the hiring process for hiring a chair, because a lot of these SIDs don't really get training per se on what it looks like to be a SID. And that's a pretty critical role on the board when you have that chair transition. So that's something that we're trying to support them with just an education and engagement piece around how you're trying to build a criteria to bring a broader field of talent into the room. How do you assess them in a way? What are the qualities you're looking for in someone that might be a first-time chair, right? So rather than an established one. So it's just trying to get them to think more broadly about what they can look for, but it's not an easy topic at all.
No.
I wanted to ask, so can we've got about 18 minutes left, if not less. So the audience, if you've got any more questions, do put them into the chat. Otherwise, I've still got more to ask Karen. Karen, I wanted to talk about the Black Lives Matter and the kind of change that's maybe happened since then, because it brought a lot of attention, the BLM protests for Black professionals in the workplace. And following all the promises that were made by companies to do better, do you think we've really seen change happen? Because it's about 3.5 years later, actually.
It is. And look, there has been lots of pledges, lots of commitment. I do, and again, I want to give grace, because I do want to say that there are more conversations happening now than there ever were about and look, you have things like in the UK, you have the Parker Review. There is more conversations around it, but my concern is that 3.5 years later, that pace of change and that focus and that ambition is starting to wade, especially when you're contending with a cost of living crisis, a war in the Ukraine, a war that's now happening in the Middle East. It becomes deprioritized. So that crescendo of ambition and that crescendo of, everybody making pledges and commitments, that has absolutely waned. But I still think there is a core group that are still having the right conversation. So I will give grace where it's due. And look, it's down to make sure that it doesn't fall off a priority list altogether. And I don't want there to be another murder for it to then bubble back up again. I really genuinely don't. But look, it's there. It's just, I just think the pace of that ambition and the pace of that focus has slowed right down.
Completely agree. And Karen, the campaign we put together just as the protests were happening with the If Not Now When campaign, and we now have about 80 plus CEOs that have signed it, like an open letter to drive Black and race inclusion. We've definitely seen it a lot harder to engage, keep those CEOs engaged in taking action. And like you say, I think other priorities start to take priority rather than say race and Black inclusion, which is one small part they see of their job. But it's like, if you don't, we both know that if you're not purposeful and proactive about any kind of diversity intervention, nothing happens.
Like
nothing will change. So I know that you and I are always banging the drum to get companies to do more, but it takes more than just us. I think it really also depends on the CEO that you're working with. So we're about to launch this big program with M&S, for instance. So with Stuart, their CEO, but he's driving it, right? Because he wants to accelerate the development of his racially diverse employees in the organization. So seeing things like that, that's him making it happen, like him personally taking ownership of it, which I think makes a big difference.
Brilliant.
I wanted to ask, the next question was, do you remember a few years ago? I'm sure, Karen, because obviously I've interviewed you before, but a few years ago, I think it was for like an Empower event. And I asked you the question, well, you actually said this in the interview. You talked about when it comes to representation, you always say a business should be a fruit salad and not a smoothie. Can you explain what you meant by that? Because it was such a great line back then. I want you to explain it to the audience today.
Yeah, I always talk about trying to build an Avengers assemble of talent. So that fruit salad of talent. So where you've got richness and vibrancy and flavor that are side by side, that create something delicious when it's put together as a collective. That's different to a smoothie where the fruit's lost its identity and it's blended together to become a homogeneous substance. What you want is that difference and that vibrancy to be able to sit side by side to create something beautiful. That's what I mean. So I want people to be able to keep their identity, to come into an organization with their lived experience and with the authenticity and with their diverse backgrounds, because I think that's what fuels creativity, rather than trying to create Stepford wives of people. And to have, I always try and look for cultural add, not cultural fit. And I think there's a big difference. You've got to look for a cultural add, not a cultural fit. And that's what I mean by that fruit salad of people.
But I think that's a very hard thing to get companies to actually do, because they always talk about, because remember, at an executive level, we run a lot of mandates or recruitment processes for clients, be it board or exec, and they'll always talk about culture fit. How do you think we try and change the conversation to think about culture add?
Look, there are some organizations that I know that you work with that sort of say they're not a X type person. And it's, well, if you want more X type people, you're going to get the same sort of X type thinking. And it's that avoidance of group think. It's as simple as that. And there are enough examples where there has been group think, where nobody's been able to point out or surface or raise things which are being done which are harmful to the organization or harmful to growth or not at the service of their customers. And you need that different injection of stimulus and creativity, which I know is hard for people to wrap their head around. I know it is. People worry about, well, they're not going to get on with this person. There's going to be more tension. There's going to be conflict. And yes, there may well be, but the end result is almost always better. And I believe in healthy tension. I really believe in that, because it's everybody bringing in their lived experience, what they've gone through, their knowledge base, their expertise from different angles. It makes your end output better. It may take longer to get there. I get it. You know, the other than a fruit salad, the other analogy I use is that Avengers Assemble. You know, I've got a 13-year-old boy who was really into I watched a lot of Marvel during lockdown with him. And, you know, I genuinely believe you want those different superhero skills to come out. And it doesn't mean they'll always get on. I know Captain America and Iron Man don't always get on, but they put their differences to one side for the benefit of S.H.I.E.L.D. So the benefit of the Avengers. And that's what you want. You want that add, not fit. We don't want all Iron Men, or we don't want all Captain Americas, do we?
Yeah, agree.
Well, in there.
Well, I watched the new the Marvels film yesterday. I don't know if you've seen that.
I haven't seen it yet.
You'll probably take Isaac, I imagine, soon. But
no, he doesn't want to hang out with his mum anymore, Suki. No.
But if you take him to the cinema, I think he would. But the the three main superheroes were all women, first of all. But one was a black woman, one was a white woman, and then the other one was the Pakistani Muslim superhero. I forget, Kamila Khan, I think her name is, or something like that. And it was amazing to see, actually, because we've not seen that before. Like three leading diverse women, I suppose, like as main characters in an action film. I gave it a solid 7 out of 10. Thought it was good. Yeah. So the next question, I want to talk about microaggressions. So microaggressions from colleagues and managers against people of color in the workplace are an enduring problem. So how do you think businesses can effectively address these?
So I have something I prepared earlier, Suki. So I don't know if you can all see this. This is something which was created by a charity for our sector called NABS, and one of our agencies, which is Ogilvy, put this together about the effect that microaggressions can have on individuals. And somebody a while ago, actually, I think it was during lockdown, when I was doing a virtual session like this, somebody gave a really brilliant analogy about what it felt like. It's, you know, it's a bit like a mosquito bite when you get that microaggression. It's a bit like being bitten by a mosquito. But if you keep being bitten on your arm by a mosquito in the same place, you know, one bite, it's annoying, but you can let it go. You do it again, it itches a bit more. If you keep on having repeated bites on your arm by a mosquito in the same place, your arm becomes swollen, it becomes inflamed, it becomes infected, and it's a lot of pain. And that's what a microaggression is like. An individual one, it hurts, but you can carry on. When it's over and over again, it becomes debilitating. And I think part of the issue is people not understanding the impact that it has on the individual at the receiving end. And also part of the issue is that individual then having a viewpoint about, and it affects their confidence, it affects their ability to thrive, it affects their mental health, and it will affect that talent remaining at your organization.
Karen, did you want to give some examples of what microaggressions are, just to make it real for the audience?
It will be small things like as a Black woman, if I'm delivering or running a meeting or in a meeting, it can be a small thing like mention, oh, that's a little bit aggressive from her. Oh, that wasn't that. That was a bit too. And that's the thing that normally gets thrown at Black women, that we're quite aggressive in terms of our delivery of communication. So it's little things about, you know, a delivery of communication that could be a little bit aggressive, or a comment about somebody's hair can be another small microaggression. And it's just that, it's those small comments that on their own don't seem like a lot, but collectively they're harmful. They are genuinely harmful when you receive them over and over again. You know, or people, look, I've had this before, you know, being promoted into a role and people going, well, it's only because, you know, there was a quota, or, you know, she's the diversity hire. It's those sort of little comments that can undermine, and they happen over and over again.
I think Tamara, you've got a question, I think. Did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I mean, maybe just if you pull out your crystal ball for a second and look at the kind of Gen Z generation, and I have a son and have seen all the Marvel movies too, but if we think about when our children are, you know, in the workforce and you know, because it's such a different mindset, they have such a different exposure now. So, you know, what do you see happening? I'm so curious. You know, I keep thinking about when our kids are, you know, our age and running the show. What, you know, what do you see?
Well, look, that's half the issue, because I don't know if they want to run the organisations that we've created. I think they're going off and doing their own thing. So look, I have a lot of hope on the one hand, because they see how we have messed up so much in terms of our generation and not sorted it out and not got it right. But on the other hand, I know so many of the Gen Z generation that do not want to enter into the corporate world at all and are setting up and doing their own things, which is great. But then that doesn't help us in terms of the longevity of the organizations and the corporations that we've created. So on the one hand, I do see hope, but the other hand, I see them rejecting corporate life.
And also, I think the world of work was hugely, I think, transformed during the pandemic, right? The whole world was working from home. And then seeing that kind of return to work or return to office post-pandemic has been really interesting. And that also, I think, is varied either in the UK and the US. So you think about the way in which we work. I think there was a study by KPMG a few weeks ago where they surveyed CEOs, where I think 2/3 of them said that by 2025 will be in the office 5 days a week. 2/3 of CEOs. And we know that Gen Z don't want to be in office 5 days a week. Actually, some of them don't want to be in at all, but some of them do want to be in for learning and development, right? Because they'll learn more being in an office. So I think that kind of push and pull factor for the workplace, you're completely right, Karen. A lot of them don't want to go into corporate life.
Yeah.
And actually, it's going to take, if we're having surveys now from CEOs saying that we're all going to go back in full time, there's a huge battle to be had there about talent, quite frankly, because the talent will speak for itself. I remember even in the US, I think Grindr, the tech platform, gay dating platform, they mandated people to go back to the office 2 or 3 days a week. And I think half their workforce resigned and are now unionizing, right? So the people or talent themselves will speak for themselves. They'll walk, they'll find something else, or go to another company that is maybe a little bit more inclusive. So I think the world of work is still quite difficult, I would say, to navigate.
I think we're finding it's finding its feet again, isn't it? It really is.
And you have gorgeous offices, by the way. I haven't been into your office for ages. It was so nice popping in.
Have you been into the Rose Court one?
No, I don't think so. No, it was the one on
Blackfriars Village.
Yeah.
You need to go into the other one as well. And we're opening another one.
Well, give me a date and I'll be there, Karen. But we are out of time. So I think I'm gonna have to hand over to Tamara, who's going to close us out. But lovely to see you, Karen.
And you, Suki, thank you.
Yeah, just to say huge thank you, Suki, to you for taking us through the conversation, and Karen for all of your insights. It's really important And I'm glad we were able to unpack some of these issues today. Thanks to our audience for listening in, for your questions. Again, this is an ongoing series that we run at British American Business. We have recorded this. We will share it afterwards in case you'd like to pass it along to any of your colleagues or partners so that they can hear what we've been talking about, because it's really important. So thanks, everyone. Suki, Karen, thank you again, and see you all soon.
Pleasure.
Bye.
Thank
Have a
you.
good day. Bye.